Hi, this is Tom McGrath, editor of Philadelphia Magazine. Thanks for joining us for day 2 of Philadelphia Magazine's ThinkFest. Our conversation this afternoon is about the future of criminal justice in Philadelphia, featuring Police Commissioner Danielle Outlaw being interviewed by 6ABC's Tamala Edwards. Issues of policing are obviously uppermost in people's minds these days, and we're pleased to be able to host this conversation. Thank you to Commissioner Outlaw for making herself available. Before we get to our interview, I'd like to say thanks to our sponsors, including ThinkFest's presenting sponsor, Bank of America, as well as St. Joseph's University, T0 Group, and Paperboy Media Group. We'll be hosting these ThinkFest conversations all this week at noon and 4 p.m. I hope you can join us for all of them. I'd also like to invite you to join us for a special virtual wellness event next month, Be Well Philly Fest. Find more details at phillymag.com/BeWellPhilly. Our interview with Commissioner Outlaw was recorded earlier today. Thank you for tuning in.
Commissioner Outlaw, welcome to ThinkFest. It is great to get to do this with you this afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
There is so much to get to, and I thought we'd start with some of the big questions of the day. And of course, probably the biggest one at this moment is the conversation around defund the police. I saw the opinion piece you wrote in the Inquirer, where number one, you said this is not a new argument. This has been around for a minute. But you also made some other interesting points. You said my people need time. They need equipment. They need things that money goes to. We need other agencies to step in and take some of the burden so they can get into the community. And I wondered if actually everybody's talking about the same thing. If they took some of that money and put it into those other agencies, it would actually work out. So if they were saying defund as in redistribute, we could actually make this work.
Yeah, I still haven't seen uniformity around what defund the police means. If you speak to some folks, there is a narrative around redistribution. If you speak to other folks, it's completely abolishing the police department and using all of those funds and and redirecting those towards social services. I think what's important for us to focus on is recognizing that we cannot police our way out of the social determinants that drive crime. Right? We all recognize that there are so many factors, whether it's education, housing, all of the economic equalities and equities that we've been talking about around this public health crisis that we're still in. It hasn't been canceled, by the way, right? That's its own niche in itself. And there's a lot of spillover into law enforcement. So we really should be also having a conversation around what are we calling the police for? We can't arrest our way out of these situations. So given again that there's a plethora of social determinants that drive crime, where are we placing our focus? I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an and. We still need, especially now more than ever, when we're talking about reform and accountability, that stuff costs money, and there's still crime. We still have to be reactive. As much as we love to be proactive, we still have to be reactive as well. So when you take away funding from a police department, what that does, given that the majority of our costs are around personnel, that means layoffs ultimately. And that's simply something that we cannot afford to do. When we talk about early intervention systems, when we talk about training, whether it's implicit bias training or whatever it is, getting the resources to the police department that we need in order for us to be the department that the community wants, it's going to cost some money.
You brought up something interesting when you talked about the rhetoric and the words that people choose to use. As I looked at some of the signs, I passed a protest over the weekend. My boys who are young were in the car, and we saw some signs that said things like KKK police, or we're just very hard edged. And I'm sure some of the rhetoric you're hearing is very hard edged. How do you take that in and deal with it? And what would you say to people on the other side about how they choose to speak as well as what they choose to say?
I would say now is not the time for division. It's one thing to have a microphone or a bullhorn and make all these shouts and these demands, but at some point it simply becomes shouts and demands if you're not ready to come to the table with solutions. Name calling is really easy. It's even easier to do it from behind a keyboard, right? When no one's there to push back and say, okay, tell me more. That's my style. I'm willing to listen, but I'm also saying, tell me more. What do you think would be the best way to move forward? At this point, we need to be discussing a path forward. So the name calling, the insults, it lands on deaf ears because at some point you have to recognize that we're all human beings. And we all know this is a relationship, whether it's a marriage or a relationship with another family member. We have to communicate in ways that the intended recipient receives it in the way we're intending it. So if we're shouting and we're name calling, at that point it's just, it's offensive messages, as opposed to saying, let's sit down and talk about the history of policing. Let's sit down and talk about the history of relationships with the police department, specifically here in Philadelphia and the community. Let's weed out those challenges and then sit down and work toward a path forward.
I'm sure you're being asked a lot about Camden, which has seen a significant amount of progress. And it really came from being the Camden Police Department to being the Camden County Police Department. It allowed them to get out of a lot of strictures and do some new things. So in essence, what do you think about the Philadelphia PD becoming the Philadelphia County PD? Is it something you would ever consider?
I haven't even thought that far ahead, and obviously that's not a decision that I would make. That's something the administration would make, something the council would vote upon, and what the community wants. I think my marching orders, my charge right now today is the focus on the police department and what we can and should be doing to strengthen the accountability systems that we have in place now, and to make sure that whatever we put in place is long lasting, regardless of who's sitting in these seats.
Were you surprised at how well it went in Camden? Like, is there anything you take away from that you find yourself thinking about?
The answer is yes. That and I've spoken to the chief there. Camden has the ability, and not saying that the being a smaller department allows folks to do things a lot quickly. But a lot of the concepts and the self-initiated things that they did, I think, were very helpful. Getting out and having the ability and mobilize and plan a neighborhood barbecue in an area where they knew potentially some disruptors would be, I think is smart, right? Whether or not we had the ability to do that in the time we had is questionable. But I think there's clearly some takeaways, not just from what Camden did, but what other agencies did throughout this time as well. This is a real life case study. It's not over. So even though, the protests, they're still happening, at least 5 or 6 a day, even though they're becoming more peaceful, now is the time for us as a learning organization, and this is generally what happens. Police departments, police department heads, chiefs, superintendents, commissioners, we all come together and say, okay, here's how it went down for me. What did you learn? And what can we learn from each other to make sure that moving forward, we can replicate those really amazing things that went well, or moving forward, here are some pitfalls that we need to avoid. So this is going to be an ongoing process.
In Portland, one of the things that you said would help was trying to say, this is where you go if you want to protest. We have a defined space. Is that something that you would want to see here?
Well, that didn't go over well in Portland.
Well, it's a new day in a new city. You can try again.
It's because then it also raises the questions, you will have activists that will tell you, who are you to tell me where I can go? And that was done in an effort to have the ability to discern who was peaceful and who wasn't. In the end, those who are there with the intention to be disruptors and to not be peaceful, it doesn't matter where you tell them to go. But I think what we found towards the end of the week that worked really well for us is having more people available to actually go out, whether there was an organizer or not, but having more officers available to say, look, we don't want to fight with you. We want you to be here and be able to express whatever it is that you want to express within your constitutional rights. But let's have some dialogue here. And I had the opportunity, other members of my staff had the opportunity to really hear. People wanted to vent. We've been sitting on this powder keg for decades and decades and decades. And a lot of what we heard, a lot of what I heard down there on the ground wasn't even necessarily frustration towards me, wasn't necessarily frustration towards the Philadelphia Police Department, but it was frustration towards the system and all of the inequities built into the system. And this was their opportunity to basically vent. And so at this point, what I'm saying is now it's okay, what are the solutions? We've heard you, but now let's come to the table to make sure that there's meaningful change. Because I think this last week has truly been the pivotal moment.
There were times when I really wondered if we were going to work our way through the whole book of Revelations. But I'm sure you had days it felt like that too.
Yes.
You know, they're having a conversation on every level, nationally, state, locally. Wanted to, in a quick fire, bring up some of the things that they're talking about and get your read on them. I will begin with more data, this idea that we need to have more data. You agree with that or not?
As it relates to crime fighting, as it relates to accountability, pick one.
As it relates to accountability, transparency, when it comes to arrest.
Absolutely. And so when I made the reference earlier about, contemporary policing being expensive, data is a part of that. And so not only is there technology that comes along with that, there's the people, the human beings behind that to discern whatever comes from that data. We need to make sure that as a profession, we are laser focused in how we are deploying our resources, whether it's for crime prevention and reduction or internally to make sure that we have a strong read on what's going on in the organization, who our problem officers are, where there's smoke before there's fire, who are peak, who the officers are, or even I'm saying officers, but it's everyone. It's not just sworn personnel, it's everyone that represents law enforcement. Those who are performing at its highest, how do we review what those actions are, how they're performing, and put that in a bottle and replicate that throughout the organization? In order to do that, we have to track it, and that's through the use of data.
Militarization, this idea that there was a pipeline created in the late 90s where a lot of the excess that would have gone overseas came into departments and turning that around. How do you feel about that? Would you love to see some of that equipment out of the department, or you think there's a need for it?
I think there is a need for us to be prepared. I think there needs to be very strong policy around how we use it and when. We need to be mindful of the impact of just how the appearance of a lot of our tools and equipment can come across, especially for those who have experienced or have, experienced some real trauma in their lives and in their relationships with the police. But the problem around throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as I like to call it, is that we can find ourselves unprepared. The spotlight is on us, but again, for those who want to do harm, they're studying us regularly. They're studying our tactics. They're paying attention to the type of equipment that we carry, how the equipment is used, the capabilities of our equipment. And as long as there are those people out there that are studying us, we have to make sure that we stay one step ahead to make sure we do our jobs most effectively to protect the communities that we serve.
What sort of snapped your head around this week? Because I've heard you say that in various forms, that there were things you expected coming from Oakland and Portland and things where you were like, check that out. Like, what really made you go, hold up?
This level of demonstration and protest, I would say, is unprecedented. No police chief, no city has experienced this level at the same time. It's usually, oh, this is what's going on over here on the West Coast or in this one particular city, and we're all watching from afar. And that one particular region or that one particular city, like I said, becomes the case study, right? What you saw in Philadelphia was happening all throughout the country. And if you talk to any of my colleagues, they would all say, wow, no one expected that to happen and unfold in the way that it did. I think there was an expectation that level, again, with the burning and the looting, would be limited to the Minneapolis area because it happened there. But some cities, again, where I come from, Oakland, and even now in Portland, you become used to being the ground zero. If something happens anywhere in the country, you can expect for something to happen there. So I would say that the one thing that kind of made me go, oh, was not just the level of protests and, the level where it ended up, but the fact that it happened pretty much in dang near every major city across this country.
And is that an inflection point that's what you think we might see going forward, that it won't just be like, wow, Seattle's having a bad time. It's going to be 10 cities are having a bad time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which is why, when you look at it, there are over 18,000 police departments in this country. And for the longest time, we all have standards, state by state, there's standards. And then, of course, we all work under the umbrella of the Constitution. But I think that's why it's important when we talk about reform and accountability, that we have a push for more national guidelines. So we're all on the same page. Because what happens is something can happen at another agency, and then we're all thrown into this big barrel of, well, you're all terrible. And some agencies are a lot further ahead with their policies and their accountability efforts than others. So I think what this movement is showing is that there needs to be more consistency amongst all the police departments in the country.
Before I forget, one of the things that had been in the national discussion was getting rid of qualified immunity. And that's another one of those things that, depending on who describes it, you could end up feeling about it one way or the other. But this idea that it is harder to come back against an officer legally on the decisions that they make, you would keep qualified immunity or say, let's change it or get rid of it?
I think it's a discussion that needs to be had. But again, I don't believe in throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I do understand frustration. I've heard it, from communities saying, look, if I were to do some of the things that you do, I wouldn't be able to get away with it in the same way. So I think there needs to be further dialogue around it, but I don't think we throw the baby out with the bathwater on that.
Did you watch the George Floyd video? And a little background, I couldn't. I mean, part of it was personal. My family knows him. But I think I've just gotten to the point with these videos, because there's always another one that I cannot. You stand in multiple roles. You're a Black woman, a Black mother, you're an officer, you're a police chief. What did you decide to do, and what was it like for you watching that video?
I wasn't going to, but I did, because I knew in order to be able to speak intelligently about it, I needed to watch it. Generally, I pick and choose because I've seen so many of them. It can do a lot watching that type of thing over and over and over again. And I would say, almost like with anyone else, hearing a grown man call out for his mother. That just did me in. Aside from everything else, right? Again, we're human beings first. And all of us, regardless of what we look like, I think we have far more in common than not. All of us have mothers, regardless of what the relationship is. That was a big one for me. So I chose to watch it. That's something you can't unsee, and actually it's something you can't unhear. And I think for many of us in positions of influence to drive change, we are using that as our inspiration, not just with our internal messaging and explaining why it's important, not just for community to see change, but for us internally to see change. But it keeps us grounded, right? It's really easy in this profession as a defense mechanism to not watch or to not pay close attention, because when you see that on a regular basis, it impacts you mentally. But I think it keeps us grounded. It's a good checks and balances, and it reminds us that we are not to be numb when we see or we experience things like that.
We saw something this week that I can't think of a time that I'd have ever seen it before. We're so used to protesters screaming and police and their stations repeatedly, including with you. We saw officers, chiefs kneel. That is a significant, important decision to kneel. What is the importance of us seeing this, and what was it like for you to make that decision to say, this is what I'm going to do?
It was a no-brainer for me, quite honestly. And I think people forget that, just because we're law enforcement, again, we're still human beings. We still have family, we still have values, we still have beliefs. And my hope would be that as police officers, personal values align with the values of the department. So I'm not doing anything, or I haven't done anything that would put me out of step what we believe as a department, first of all. Second of all, I think folks tend to forget that we are working with. We want to work in collaboration with. I've experienced several times, I've rolled up to community meetings and, as a chief and at lower ranks, and they flat out told us they didn't want us there. That's hurtful. Some people might not, admit that, but that's hurtful because we want to be there. We want to be a part. And I understand that there are a lot of walls that need to be torn down. There's a lot of trust that needs to be rebuilt, but we're working in collaboration with. We are not and the division and the divided language and, all of that, it doesn't help us get to where we all want to be. And so sometimes as leaders, whether, official leaders or informal leaders, if you're in a position of influence within the department, we have to humble ourselves, meet people where they are, sometimes be willing to hear things that are very difficult to hear, but be a part of and show that we not only kneel in solidarity, but we are of the same community and we're working towards the same goals.
One of the questions I would imagine you might have gotten is when people watch that video, there's an officer there who is Black and an officer there who is Asian. I was looking at the officers who were arrested for Freddie Gray, and half of them were Black. How do you explain to people, do they ever ask you, how does this make sense? That they would expect the officer to say, stop, or to cut this out. Like, what do they need to understand as they watch that moment?
I don't know how to explain that. There's no way I'd be speculating, but I couldn't even come up with a strong enough speculation to explain why that occurred, quite honestly. I can't help you on that one.
We do get the sense one way or the other, change is coming. This is not a moment that's going away. When you listen to the conversations being held at every level, do you find that you meet this moment with excitement? You meet it with some demoralization, some dread? There are many ways you can go about it because a lot of the rhetoric at every level can seem as though it's against the police. But it also can be a moment of opportunity, that some new things can happen in the world as you look towards negotiating a contract in a year that maybe could not have happened at another time. How do you look at this moment? How are you feeling about it?
I see that it's clearly a moment of opportunity. It's unfortunate, all the circumstances around the incident that created this moment of opportunity. But you got to hit rock bottom, right, to truly recognize that there is no way but up from here. And I think that's where we are. This is an opportunity to be reflective, again, to humble ourselves, to be introspective, to be collaborative, to meet people where they are, listeners, to really try some really different things that might not have gone over well 2 weeks ago. A lot of departments move into reform when they have to, when they're placed under consent decrees or there's a MOU or MOA, right? When the feds say you shall do this, and then they get to where they need to be. This is an opportunity for us to recognize that it needs to happen and do it on our own and have community at the table at the same time without someone making us do this and then have to report to a federal judge. So I absolutely see this as a time of opportunity. I'm optimistic about it. And we can do this peacefully.
You've been in some departments that have had some tough times. I think I read one place, it was like, who is the chief this week? You ended up going through 3 in a week. But I'm sure people told you before you got to Philadelphia, there were sexual harassment issues to deal with, corruption issues, racist issues to deal with in a place that does not like change. They want their Wawa, they want their tasty cakes, they want everything to be the way it always was. What made you take the job?
One, I think you got to get me while I have the energy to do it.
Sounds like a parenting.
And I certainly have the energy to do it, but it's my wheelhouse. I've worked in the reform and accountability world for quite some time. And again, I bring a very unique perspective, not just having come from a reform environment in Oakland and in Portland, but my life experience, again, is a very unique perspective. And having been, in law enforcement my entire adult career, having been a Black woman, and actually, quite frankly, a Black mother my entire adult career, what I offer, I think, is unique. And there's actually quite a few people like me that just need an opportunity to be put in the seat as well. So it wasn't a deterrent. I'm all for a challenge. And I believed, if not me, then who? So why not?
Do you believe that you will get some of the things that you want at the table next year? That's always been tough for commissioners. Even if they've wanted to make changes, that table just seems to, folks ain't moving.
And it's not unique to Philadelphia, quite frankly. That's in a lot of places. The dialogue has to start now, not a couple weeks or a couple of days before negotiations start. This has to be ongoing conversation, and you chip away at it over time. And I think when everyone can recognize the benefits to both parties, I think it makes it a lot easier. Now, again, union leadership, they have a role to play. I have had representation my entire career up until I became a police chief. So I'm not anti-union. They represent their membership. But my responsibility is not just for membership, it's also for community, and it's about the entire well-being of the organization. So I'm considering all of that. And I think that, again, even with union, we can find a pathway forward, identifying benefits to all parties and stakeholders involved.
From what we hear, it's a tough time for morale in the department, especially after a week like this. Those are the guys and the women out on the street. Often probably going into situations feeling besieged and unappreciated, not nearly compensated in all the ways that they should be compensated. And now they're being asked to find the energy to make changes and to make a difference. What is it like for you yourself to stand in that? And how do you motivate 6,500 other people who may many times feel as though nobody else understands them, nobody else appreciates them, to find the strength and the will to go in a different way?
During a pandemic. Forgot that part. Right?
Oh, sorry. Locusts are coming next. I don't know.
It's challenging, but I think it's important, every day that folks have been out here, I've been here too. I'm not asking anything of anyone that I wouldn't do myself. And I absolutely know how challenging these times can be because it's the uncertainty. Again, it was the uncertainty of the pandemic, right? We're working amongst a silent killer. How do we modify our services to ensure that we're doing it in a safe way? How do I, as the leader of this organization, ensure that what I'm asking them to do can be done safely while giving them the equipment that they need to do it? Because in the very beginning, there was a shortage and we had to conserve. So you add that on to the fact that we've lost some people, whether due to the pandemic or in the line of duty, in other ways. And we've had folks injured during these protests. On top of the fact, now that you're mentioning, you know what, now we're asking you to do things differently. I wouldn't ask anyone that works for me or works with me to do anything that would put them in harm's way. I've very quickly learned that communication is important, but over communicating is key during times like this. And I do everything that I can to make it clear that I acknowledge and I appreciate the work that folks have been putting in, not just over this last however many days it's been now, we've lost track, but just in the time that I've been here, because it's been a tough time. When you go through, having come from a department, also, you mentioned it earlier, where you have a turnover in leadership, several chiefs in one day, you want stability. You want leadership and direction. Just tell me what to do. And I'm doing the very best that I can to make sure that that's what they have, but also recognizing that there's not just a need to communicate, but to over communicate. And that's where I acknowledge that we need to improve that with technology, now that the pandemic didn't allow me to interact in ways that I usually would. So I stated them, appreciate them, hang in there. It's all for the best, and we're gonna get through this together.
Obviously for a lot of these communities, these are issues outside. This is history. This is systemic and endemic. But as with any relationship, it takes everybody to make it better. What would you say to the community that you're looking for from them as we go forward?
I would ask the community again to be willing to have the tough conversations, to be open to hearing what we have to say, but also even being willing to acknowledge that sometimes, while our jobs, some aspects of our jobs might not look the best, be willing to listen around the why behind it. It's not going to always be pretty, but there are certain aspects of policing that might not look good. We have to be willing to have crucial conversations, have difficult conversations. And again, like I said, being open and suspending any assumptions that we may have. I've heard from community in the past, specific individuals I can think of now off the top of my head that said, look, I made it an intentional point to wake up every day and have a positive interaction or a comment or even a thought about police, because for so many decades, all of my interactions were negative, and every opinion that I had about the police was negative. But I realized that in order for me to have lasting change or make an impact on the change that I've been asking for all these years, I also had to come to the table. So I would at least say, at a minimum, please come to the table, be willing to not only be heard, but listen to what we have to say as well, because I think community will often find that we're on the same page in so many different areas. I think there's an assumption that we're going to be adversaries or we disagree with what they're saying. And quite frankly, we might not agree with how to get there, but we agree with the end goal.
When you were a little girl growing up in East Oakland, not the best image of police officers, you had a cousin who was like a sibling who you saw taken away, just other perceptions that until you had an internship didn't sort of change your view. What would have made a difference to a little Danielle Outlaw on the streets if you had seen it that would have given you a different sense of the police? And how does it inform how you police right now?
I think had I been, and I had the DARE officer, right, that came to class and came with their big case of drugs and said, don't do drugs. They gave their presentation and then they left. They're like, okay, don't do drugs. We all knew don't do drugs. But all I saw was the uniform. All I saw was the big drug case, right, that they pointed to. They did the presentation and they left. Had I had an opportunity, I think, to fellowship and interact with law enforcement or police in a completely different way outside of an enforcement action, I might have seen the police in a different light at an earlier age. I didn't come from, and I know there's a lot of people like me, I don't come from a legacy of police, or even, my dad and my uncle went to the military, but I don't come from a family of career military either. And for a lot of police officers that have that, they have that ingrained in them. Either I want to grow up and be a cop like whomever their family member might be, or I respect this type of authority because I come from a military family. I didn't have that, and I know it's a lot of kids out there that don't. So the more opportunities that we have to interact with community, and specifically young people, and now being a parent of a 22-year-old and 19-year-old, having opportunities to hear where we just sit back and listen, right? Listening sessions with our young people, our young adults, we will very quickly learn that they have a lot to offer. And like I said, I had to learn it the hard way. It was a few years ago with my youngest, and now my oldest, but I thought they were, like, oh, they had a little attitude because I told them to do something, but they were frustrated because I wasn't listening to what they were having to say. And when I finally took the opportunity and took the time, and instead of being strictly the authoritarian, to hear their side, I said, oh, a couple of things there.
Yeah.
You raised them right. And what they're saying makes perfect sense and really can help inform this conversation that we're having. So when I bring that, my experience in that realm in my personal life to my professional life, that tells us that if we take the time to listen to our young people, we'll learn more about what they're experiencing, how to interact with them, and not even, I wouldn't even say how to police them, but what they need from us. There has to be more of that.
Who called who first? Did you call your sons after you saw the tape, or did they get to you first to say, Mama, I got to talk about this?
Oh man, I don't remember how it came up. We're still split up. I have one with me now, and then another one still on the West Coast. I don't remember how it came up, how the conversation did, but we just started talking about it. And when I spoke with my youngest about it, when I heard him tell me that he was in fear for his life, it really rattled me, because I said, come on now, your dad's a cop, I'm a cop, you know what to do. And so he says, it doesn't matter. My knees buckled. My knees literally buckled, because I felt so helpless. I couldn't come to the phone. I couldn't be there to help him. I couldn't be there to even just hug him, as a mother, because there was so much anxiety felt. I can hear it in his voice. There was so much he was experiencing. And the reality is, yeah, depending, I can't lock my kids in the house. I say kids, they're 22 and 19. They'll always
be your kids.
Always be your kids. But they're going to travel, right? They're going to go out and about in the world. And even though they're the kids of, everyone doesn't know that, right? We know that the reality is depending on where they are, they will be judged by their appearance first. And that's something they'll never be able to change. And I can't be with them every step of the way. They'll have to learn how to fend on their own. So it's still ongoing conversations in the house. And now it's more of, okay, Mom, now what are you doing about it?
And that's got to be tough, that you literally lay down your life for them, but this is one thing you can't by yourself make right.
Yeah.
I saw that somewhere where you said some weeks, if it's a good week, you listen to gospel coming into work. Other times, if folks need to be tuned up, it might be Tupac. What were you listening to this week?
Listen, the last 3 days, last 4 days, it's been gospel. It's been gospel.
That's a good sign. That means things are getting back to normal.
Well, no, I mean, if I need peace in the midst of the storm, if I need something to get my mind right, if I need focus, if I need clarity, if I need the ability to discern, if I'm seeking wisdom, if I'm seeking guidance during very tumultuous times, that's what I'm listening to. And I would say that, or nothing at all, just so I can have that calm, because I know what I'm about to walk in. So it has definitely been gospel, or like I said, absolutely quiet.
I'm a believer that sometimes the answers come in the silence.
Yes.
Which may be the case. I saw somewhere where you said sometimes when you get tired and you're not sure to keep going, you remember your purpose. You remember why you're here. But you didn't explain what the answer to that is. What is your purpose and why are you here?
Well, I realize in what I've said in the past is that my purpose is far greater than me. There are days where I don't feel like talking anymore. I'm talked out, or I don't feel like answering a question, or I'm just, I'm like, I'm just on overload. And then I realize that people need to see me. People need to hear from me, even when I'm exhausted. Because if they don't have the ability to hear from someone who they can relate to, regardless if I look like them or not, if they share the same ideology, I realize that I'm that vessel. I've been put in this position as a vessel, and to be a voice for many for many of those who have been voiceless and have not been heard. And so if the least I can do, whether in this role or anything else, is to offer voice and offer perspective so that the masses can be heard, that's what my purpose is. And then now that I have a seat at the table and the ability to influence change, that's my purpose. So again, when I say sometimes I'm just tired, I'm worn out, or whatever it is, when I say my purpose is greater than myself, it's up to me to utilize what I've been given in order to be the voice for many who haven't been given this opportunity.
And finally, this is an event for people who want to think and be pushed and then spend the time. If, as they go away from this, if you could get people to read one thing, think about one thing, listen to one thing, we're all doing this club together, what would it be?
Well, I would say my ask or my suggestion would be to be open, and not just open to change, just open, right? At this point, we're at, think big. Let's not just focus on what's directly ahead of us. Let's think about the very smallest things that we can do to have the absolute largest impact. But in order to do that, we have to be open to anything. Gone are the days of we've always done it like this, or we usually do it this way, or we used to do. Let's think about how we are shaping not just policing, but the relationship between our community and our police and how we police for the next 100 years. Think big.
Think big. I think that's a good note to end on. You've given us a lot of time. Thank you. And of course, we wish you well, because as you do well, our city will do well. And so thank you for your service.
Thank you so much.